You ever hit that sweet spot in life where you finally think, and quote, man, I've earned this peace, and quote, only to watch some platinum-haired menace try to snatch it away in the most unbelievable way possible? I'm talking about the kind of person who treats a clipboard like a scepter and thinks a zip code gives them the right to redraw the borders of your soul. Or in my case, the borders of the land I bled for. My name's Elias Thorne, and for 25 years, I was a field surveyor for the Department of the Interior, which is basically a fancy way of saying I spent my life tramping through mud, staring through transit lenses, and dealing with bureaucrats who couldn't and oppose to find their own backside with a GPS and a flashlight. I'd seen every trick in the book. Developers moving pins under the cover of darkness, local officials in quote, losing in quote, plat maps when an envelope of cash showed up, you name it. So when I finally hung up the boots and bought my 12-acre slice of heaven out in the rugged high country of the Bitterroot Valley, I didn't oppose. Just buy it. I verified it with the soul of a man who'd been lied to by experts. I spent months digging through dusty county archives, cross-referencing survey notes from the 1950s, and running my own LiDAR scans until that deed was so clean you could have performed open-heart surgery on it, and I built my house right in the center of it. A two-story structure of heavy timber and glass where the only rules were the ones the wind made up as it whistled through the ponderosa pines. I thought I was safe. I really did, because I deliberately built 500 feet outside the boundary of the Silver Creek Heights Homeowners Association, a place filled with cookie-cutter mansions and people who spent more time worrying about the height of their neighbor and oppos, grass than the state of their own marriages. But trouble has a funny way of finding you even when you're off the grid. And for me, trouble rolled up my gravel drive in a white luxury SUV that looked like it had never seen a speck of dust in its life. Out stepped Margaret Sterling, the self-appointed queen of the heights, wearing sunglasses so big they looked like welding goggles, and carrying a folder with the kind of stiff-back posture that usually precedes a lawsuit. She didn't oppose. Wave, she didn't oppose. Smile, she just stood there at the edge of my porch while I was mid-sip of my morning coffee and told me, in a voice that sounded like frozen silk, that my, quote, aesthetic choices, quote, were causing quote, visual disharmony, quote, for the community. I remember looking at her, then looking at my stack of seasoned firewood, and then looking back at her before telling her, as politely as a man with a caffeine deficiency can, that since I wasn't oppose, tea in her club, her opinion on my firewood held about as much weight as a wet paper bag. She just gave me this thin, reptilian smile, set a gold-embossed envelope on my porch rail like it was a hazardous material, and told me that, quote, community standards are a ripple, Mr. Thorne, and they dawn in oppos. Stop just because they're in oppos. As a fence in a way, quote. I burned that first letter, and the second one about my satellite dish, and the third one about the, quote, unauthorized, quote, stone wall I'd built with my own two hands. But things went from annoying to nuclear one Tuesday morning when Margaret showed up with a shivering kid in a cheap suit who handed me a formal notice of encroachment. I opened it right there, expecting more nonsense about paint colors, but my heart actually skipped a beat when I saw what they'd done. It was a map, or at least a crude imitation of one, with jagged red lines drawn over a satellite image claiming that my entire workshop, my wraparound deck, and a good 30 feet of my master bedroom were actually sitting on, quote, common HOA recreational land, quote. They weren't oppose. Just complaining anymore. They were trying to take my home, claiming I'd built on their dirt, and demanding I, quote, vacate and restore the grade, quote, or sign over the improvements to the association as a gift. I laughed a loud, jagged sound that echoed off the ridge, and I told Margaret that if she didn't oppose to get off my property in 10 seconds, I was going to call the sheriff, a man I'd gone fly fishing with for a decade. But she didn't oppose to even flinch. She just adjusted her glasses and said, quote, we'll see what the soil says, Elias, quote, before driving off and leaving me with a pit in my stomach that wouldn't oppose to go away. See, I knew she was lying, but I also knew how these people worked. They rely on you being too tired or too poor to fight, but they forgot one thing. I am a surveyor, and I know exactly where the bones are buried. That afternoon, I grabbed my old professional-grade total station and headed down to my southern boundary, and what I found made my blood run cold. Someone had been out there. I found the faint, circular scars in the dirt where my original brass pins had been pulled, and new, identical-looking pins had been hammered in exactly 32 feet north of where they belonged. It was professional, it was clean, and it was a felony, but it was also the biggest mistake Margaret Sterling ever made because she didn't in Oppos. T realized that when you move a line on a map, you're not just changing where the grass is, you're changing the math of everything around it. I called my old buddy Silas, a man who could read a topographic map in the dark, and we spent 3 days doing silent survey, moving through the brush like ghosts, and what we found was the ultimate irony in her rush to, expand, the HOA's land to swallow my house. Margaret had authorized the construction of her own massive 3-story glass, meditation wing, and an infinity pool that was now sitting, according to the real law of the land, entirely on my property. She had spent nearly $1 million building a palace on dirt she didn't in Oppos. Tion, all because she thought she could bully a retired, civil servant, into submission, but I wasn't in Oppos. T gonna just tell her. I was going to let her bury herself. I waited until the following Sunday, the day of the HOA's annual, champagne in the pines, gala, which they were holding on the very strip of land she claimed was theirs, and I watched through binoculars as they set up white tents and oyster bars on my meadow. I didn't in Oppos. I didn't in Oppos. T stormed down there with a shotgun. Instead, I called the county marshal and the building inspector, and I sat on my porch with a fresh pot of coffee as the blue and red lights started snaking up the mountain road. The look on Margaret's face when the marshal told her, in front of all her wealthy donors, that she was currently trespassing on a private crime scene was worth more than every penny I had in the bank. She started screaming about, clerical errors, informal agreements, but I just walked down the hill, handed the building inspector my certified LiDAR overlays and the security footage I'd recovered from a hidden trail cam showing her, landscaping crew, moving the pins at 3 a.m., and watched the color drain from her face until she looked like a ghost in a designer dress. The court case was a bloodbath, plain and simple, because you can argue about, visual harmony, all day, but you can't argue with geodetic math and a video of yourself committing land fraud. The judge, a no-nonsense woman who had clearly dealt with HOA power trips before, didn't in Oppos. T just rule in my favor. She went for the jugular, ordering Margaret to not only pay for the, restoration, of my land, but declaring that because the construction of her meditation wing and pool was done with, malicious intent and knowledge of falsified boundaries, those structures were now legally considered, abandoned improvements, on my property. She was ordered to demolish them at her own expense, but the fines and the legal fees stripped her dry, and when she couldn't in Oppos, T-Pay, the bank moved in faster than a mountain lion on a crippled deer. A few months later, I sat at the county auction and bought her entire foreclosed estate for a fraction of its value. Not because I wanted a mansion, but because I wanted the land back, and I wanted to make sure no one like her ever stood on that ridge again. I spent the next year tearing down the fences, filling in that ridiculous infinity pool, and gutting the interior of her, palace, to turn it into something that actually mattered. I called up a local veteran in Oppos, this outreach group, and we converted the whole place into a transition center, a quiet, solid place where guys coming back from overseas could find some peace, do some woodworking in my shop, and look at the mountains without some, queen, telling them their firewood was too high. Looking back on it, I realized that peace ISN and Oppos. T's something you can just buy and fence off. It's something you have to defend, sometimes with a lawyer, and sometimes with a transit lens. Margaret thought she was redrawing a map, but all she did was show me exactly where my purpose was. But now I've got to ask you, did I go too far by taking her house? Or was that just the price of her trying to erase my home? And have any of you ever had to go to war with an HOA just to keep what's yours? Drop your stories in the comments, because I have a feeling I'm not the only one who's had to fight for the dirt under my feet.